Dr. Cori Lathan, and I'm an inventor. I'm a neuroscientist, and I'm a biomedical engineer, so would be happy to answer questions about all of those. I started my company, Anthrotronics, about 20 years ago because I was inspired about the future of technology and what we as humans could do with the help of technology. So before I dive into that, let me just give you a little more insight into the company. Does anyone know what anthro means? What other words have the root anthro in it? Does anyone in the chat tell me what anthro means? I don't know if the students are on the chat yet, but feel free to jump in there. So anthro, human, tronics, instrumentation. So I started the company because I was really inspired by how we could connect human capability with technology to achieve things that we hadn't done before, whether that's an astronaut trying to live and work in space, whether you're trying to perform a remote surgery through a robot, or whether you're just trying to have better mobility through a better knee. So it can be a very individual thing, or it can be something that a whole community is trying to do. So what I wanted to do was just go through a little bit about what I wanted to cover in this chat. And we can cover other things as well, but I wanted to at least get some basics in terms of what is a neuroscientist and a biomedical engineer, and how I became those things, and then why I started a company. How can technology keep us healthy? What is brain health? And how can we keep our brains healthy? So hopefully those themes will run throughout the next 15, 20 minutes, and feel free to jump into the chat with questions. If you want to interrupt me as we go along, this can be a conversation. I also have points where I'll ask for your input. So let's see, with that, let's start with what is a neuroscientist. You know, I think most of you are high school students and probably have heard of neuroscience, the study of the central nervous system, the brain, the spinal cord. And so a neuroscientist is simply someone who studies the brain, and even more broadly, the nervous system. What's important about being a neuroscientist is that a lot of times we're really looking at the impact that the brain has on behavior and cognition, how we think, how we learn, because all of that is mediated by the brain. And so much of, and everything that we do is mediated by the brain. So it's actually, you really can't look at any other part of your body without thinking about how the brain is involved. So that makes it very exciting. You can never get bored studying the brain, that's for sure. So biomedical engineering. So biomedical engineering, I think the official definition is applying engineering principles and materials to medicine and healthcare. For me, biomedical engineering is simply developing technology that helps people with their performance. As I said earlier, I think technology should enable people. It should enable people to do things they couldn't do before they had technology. So to me, that's what biomedical engineering is. So let me go back in time. So this is me in second grade. And I was fascinated with Star Trek. I loved Star Trek. And particularly, I loved the technology. I loved the replicator and the holodeck and the tricorder. And I had a great second grade teacher who designed a whole curriculum around becoming the captain of the Starship Enterprise at the time. So that was exciting to me. And I think it put me on a lifelong journey of being interested in the power of technology to enable us to explore, to create. And I went on to college to study biopsychology and mathematics. Now, that is not actually a real major. I made it up because I didn't take enough courses in any one department to actually major in that one thing. So I had to make up a special major in biopsychology and mathematics. But I wanted to be an astronaut. I was interested in aerospace technology because I wanted to be an astronaut, but I didn't want to build rockets. I wasn't really interested in how we get there. I wanted to know how we live there. So I didn't know what I needed to study to sort of learn about that. You know, I didn't know what that was called. So I just started looking around and trying to find people who were doing that kind of work. And I ended up at MIT studying both aerospace engineering and neuroscience, because the field of biomedical engineering didn't actually exist at the time. So I didn't make it to space, but I ended up working with some amazing people who were studying the effects of space on the brain. And I actually got to fly in zero gravity on what they call the Vomit Comet, because it's when you do parabolic flight, which you can see in the corner, the airplane actually makes a parabola. And it's like throwing a ball. When you're swinging your arm, the ball, think of if you're sitting on that ball, you're pressed against the ball. Sort of think of a roller coaster as you accelerate up the top of going up a roller coaster. That's double gravity. And then when the plane, let's say you throw a ball in the air, it's kind of like throwing the plane in the air, you're experiencing zero gravity. And then you go back to double gravity, because if you didn't accelerate, you'd hit the ground. So when you go from double gravity to zero gravity to double gravity 40 times, you can imagine why it's called the Vomit Comet. So, but that's okay. You know, you sort of do what you need to do and then you get back to work. And so we were studying the brain because we still don't know a lot about the brain. And when we first started traveling in space, we didn't know if the brain would really work without gravity. I mean, we just didn't know. So we were worried that, it turns out, of course, it does work, but it changes. So much of what we perceive in the world is dependent upon gravity. So let me tell you a little bit about some of the other things that my company has done, and then we'll sort of go deep more into more of the brain health. But you'll see it's definitely a theme that's running through this. My PhD thesis was actually to look at how our visual system and our vestibular system, our balance system, would change in space. And we're going to do a demo together, okay? So I know you're all at home, but you can do this at home, and it's very simple. So what I want you to do is put your hand in front of your face. And Dawn, you have to do this too, so I know someone's doing it. Okay, so put your hand in front of your face and keep your head still, but shake your hand so that it's blurry. Okay, stop. Was it blurry? I think it was. All right. So now keep your hand still and shake your head. Did it get blurry? Did your hand get blurry? My guess is no. So tell me if that didn't work for you, but try it again if it did, because what happens is when your head is still and your hand is moving, you're only using your eyes to try and focus. And your brain can't interpret that signal fast enough to focus. But when you move your head, your balance system has what's called a 3-neuron arc. It's a very quick signal right through your brain to your eyes, which corrects for the head movement. So your brain can correct extremely fast for head movement, where it doesn't actually work so well just with your visual system. Well, the balance system is also very dependent on gravity. And so the concern, a very real concern about flying in space, is that because we didn't have that input from this 3-neuron arc, or it would be misinterpreted from the brain, and people would get motion sick in space, which we know they do. And people would misperceive, and astronauts would misperceive distances. Maybe they couldn't operate a robot in space. We know there were some mistakes made controlling robots in space. Was that because they misjudged distances? Because we all learn that here on Earth. So again, the brain is a very, very sensitive. So let me move on and tell you a few more of the projects that we've worked on and connect it to the brain, and then I'll back up and talk a little bit more about the brain itself. I had a good comment, poor astronauts. Yes, it's not an easy job. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit more about what we did in my from my company. I mentioned we studied, well, let me continue on with the space example. So because of this experience working with the astronauts, we were asked to actually develop a virtual reality system. And now I think a lot of you have experienced virtual reality. There's many gaming systems out there that have immersive virtual reality that are amazing. If you get the opportunity to try something like the Oculus Rift, it's just a really phenomenal experience. But this was, quite some time ago. And so we really had to design a virtual reality system almost from scratch. And the purpose of it was very simple. It was to ask the astronauts to estimate the size of objects in space. And again, this gets back to the brain reinterpreting sizes, shapes, distances of the space around us. And we really wanted to understand through virtual reality what the astronauts were perceiving. So we would show them, we would show them an object and ask them to set it to maybe be a cube which has all equal sides. And they would set it to something that looked like a squashed, it's almost like a pancake. So we were learning that they were not perceiving things the same way that they were on Earth. So that was a really interesting experiment, and I think really helped figure out how do we train astronauts for future space flights. So I have a question here. Did any of the astronauts lose their air? You mean for breathing? That happened a long time ago on a Soyuz, on a launch vehicle, but that has not happened in our current space program on the station or on the shuttle. They've actually had good backup systems. So if you meant something different than that, please enter it in the chat. But they all have been able to stay fairly healthy in space. All right, so let me tell you about some of the other pictures there. So you see here a glove. It's called the Acela glove. So this was something we developed, and we developed it for a whole bunch of different reasons. We worked with some folks who were developing it for sign language, to digitize sign language. We worked with the military to capture hand gestures of soldiers when they're trying to control a robot, that they could control it with their hand instead of trying to pull out a joystick and control a robot. And we also designed it to work with surgeons who were learning to do surgery, so surgical training. Because when you learn to tie a knot, for example, when you're doing surgery, it's a very complicated hand movement. And there's not a lot of feedback except trial and error. So what we did is we embedded these sensors in a glove to help train people, to help people learn. Because it turns out that you learn better, your brain works better if you do it in a multi-sensory, hands-on way for a lot of tasks. That's not true for everyone, and that's not true for every task. But if you can adopt systems of learning, so particularly for something that's very hands-on, like surgery, being able to do it through feedback from digitizing your hand movements actually turns out to be very effective. And then the last example I wanted to give you, this little boy over here with a cute robot, that's Cosmobot is the robot. And the robot, what we did is we started working with kids with disabilities. And these kids have all kinds of disabilities, whether it's cerebral palsy, which can affect both your muscle movement as well as your brain, autism, which is also neurological, affects your brain. And what we were doing is we were using the robot to help them both learn and do physical therapy. So for example, with a child with cerebral palsy, that you want to work on movement, like say movement of your arms, but it's a lot better to do it in the context of learning. So we might play a Simon Says game with them. The robot could say, Simon says, lift up your arms. And it gets feedback from the sensors to know if the child has done that or not. Let's see, I see some questions. Let's see. Is it possible to use that for people on Earth? And do I own my company? And do I like my job? Oh, good. So lots of good questions coming in. So yeah, let me answer some of those questions, and then we'll move on and dig into some more things about brain health and technology. Let's see. So the virtual reality system on Earth, I think that's what you're referring to. Yes, absolutely. And in fact, we did a lot of the same research that we were doing in space here on Earth, because we wanted what's called a control group. Whenever, a lot of you have probably been introduced to the scientific method. And when you ask a question, it's important to control for some of the main variables. So we did the same experiments with people on Earth as and the same experiment in space. So we could compare. So we could really see, do people on Earth do the tasks differently? Do they perceive things differently? We also use the subjects as their own controls. So for example, this astronaut here, Greg, did the experiment on Earth before he went into space for several months. He then went into space, did the experiment, and then came back to Earth and did the experiment again. So you actually can have the same person be their own control when you do an experiment. And that's actually a very powerful way to test a hypothesis. Let's see, a couple questions about my company. Yes, I do own my company. We have been funded primarily through government grants, which means that I can keep ownership of my company. And basically what I do is, when I have a new project, I bring in people all through my network, through my colleagues, through universities, through other companies, and I put together a team to do a new project. And I'm going to describe one of those projects in just a moment. Let me see if there are any other questions about what I'm talking about now, and then we can move on. We have some pretty complicated questions. Okay, so boy, these are all good questions, but a little bit out of the scope of what we're talking about here. So why do we have gravity on Earth but not in space? That's a good one to Google, because there's like great, graphics and things like that. But basically, it's acceleration. Gravity is acceleration. So we're actually, gravity is actually us falling toward the center of the Earth. And as you move farther away from the Earth, we go into what's free fall, and we fall around the Earth. So when you're orbiting the Earth, it's actually free fall. So I don't have time to get into all of the physics of gravity, but that's a great question, and I encourage you to do some research on it. With the Acela glove, did you load data from the glove into the software? Oh, and create a movie afterwards for surgeons? Yeah, so what we did with the glove, we were focused on a couple things. We wanted to make the data as good as possible. So we put in lots of sensors so that we could really define how the fingers were moving. So that was the first goal. That was kind of the hardware and, the electrical, the sensors and circuits. And so that was a really interesting part of engineering, which isn't my expertise, but I have some fantastic people who are great mechanical and electrical engineers, and that's why you need a team, because you can't be good at everything. So that was one part. We had to design the glove so it was very, very sensitive to movement. Then, yes, absolutely, we connected those sensors to the computer, and then now you have lots of data coming in from the sensors. So you have to put the data together in a way that's usable for all sorts of different applications. So we put together kind of a user interface so that surgeons could look at the data and play back the movement, or musicians could use the data and play back the movement. So we tried to make it, instead of going with one application, we said, let's make the data available and let people build their own applications. So we had lots of different sign language, we had lots of different types of people using our glove. Let me go on a little bit, and then I'll come back to some of these questions, because I definitely want to talk a little bit more about brain health and technology. So I've already talked to you about how important the brain is and how integrated it is to everything that we do. But we also know what happens when things go wrong with the brain, right? You've probably all heard of Alzheimer's disease. Maybe you have a grandparent or a relative with Alzheimer's. It's also called dementia. And in its early stages, it's called mild cognitive impairment. But it's very often it progresses. You certainly have heard of concussions. Concussions affect the brain very much. But you know what? Lots of other things that maybe you didn't think about. Medications, there's reasons why you shouldn't drive on some medications, or there's reasons why some medications make you sleepy or change your mood or your behavior. They affect the brain. A big one is depression and mental health. Depression and anxiety, all of those are because of effects on the brain. And then other things, more common things that you wouldn't necessarily think about. Stress, fatigue. Have you ever tried to study when you're exhausted and you just can't think and you keep reading the same thing over and over again? It's because your brain, the pipeline to your brain has kind of shut down. It's said enough already. I've had enough. So the brain is really affected by everything you do. And in turn, those effects can turn into some of the states that I have here on the board. But here's the thing that I recognized. About 10 years ago, I was approached by some of our colleagues in the military who said that soldiers who were deployed were not only getting concussions, they were also getting combat fatigue and stress and not able to do their job. They were getting depression, PTSD, some of you may have heard of, post-traumatic stress. And they also were committing suicide or dying by suicide. And it was a big crisis. And so we really took a big look at brain health. And it was really kind of shocking because as important as brain health is, which I think we would all agree, we don't really look at it. And here's a really good example of that. You've all been to the doctor's office. And when you go to the doctor's office, they take your height, your weight, your blood pressure, your temperature. In fact, sometimes it gets annoying because you're going in there, just to get your annual shot or something, and they want to know your height and your weight. Well, they always are taking what they call your vital signs. How come they don't take a brain vital? We track our body mass index, our height and our weight from the time we're born, but we don't actually track our brain health, our brain vital. And that was a big eye-opener for me to realize, wait a minute, we should be able to sensitively measure changes in the brain so we can know if any of these problems are occurring. So we put together a team. Oh, well, actually, before I get onto the team, I wanted to say this is, I wanted to talk about some of the implications of this fact that we've been ignoring our brain and the pervasive problems that we have. I mentioned dementia and Alzheimer's. 44 million people worldwide have dementia. And actually this month, the month of May, is Mental Health Awareness Month. And so I thought this statistic was also really important to talk about today a little bit more. 450 million people worldwide have mental illness. And it's the leading cause, depression and anxiety are the leading cause of disability worldwide. And it's something that's not well understood. There's a big stigma attached to mental illness, even though 1 in 4 people will experience some sort of mental or neurological disorder. 17% of youth in the US, that youth are defined as 6 to 18, I believe. And every 40 seconds, someone dies by suicide. There's lots of resources now. Crisis text line, you can just text 24/7 to 741-741 for any reason. There's a bill right now in Congress. It passed the Senate, and it's in Congress, and it's to designate 988 as mental health hotline, just like 911. Is for emergencies. This is for mental health. So 988, hopefully it'll pass the House as well. So that we can talk more about Mental Health Month if you want, but I wanted to really make the connection between brain health and mental health, especially since it is Mental Health Awareness Month. So let's keep going. So why is it so hard to tell if the brain is healthy? Why don't we have a brain vital? Why don't we have a brain thermometer? Well, to tell if the brain is healthy, and if you've ever had a concussion, you know this, maybe they'll take you, if it's right away, they might take you to do a CAT scan, which uses X-ray, or they might take you to do an MRI, which is a little bit better because it doesn't use the X-ray, so it's a little bit safer for you. But it uses magnetic fields instead. So, but it's very expensive, it's very time consuming, and it really only tells you if the structure of the brain has been hurt. So if actually bone has been cracked, or there's bleeding, or so it doesn't really tell us anything about the activity of the brain. So then there's another way, electrical activity. You can actually put electrodes on the brain or on your head and measure the activity of your brain. But it's not very accurate. There's not enough data or accuracy for you to be able to tell the difference, to tell if there's something really wrong. Although if there's something, again, it's one of these things where if it's just a little bit of a change, you probably can't tell. If there's something grossly wrong with the activity, you can probably pick it up. But again, it's expensive. It's not very clinically acceptable yet, but it's getting there. Neurotechnology is something to keep an eye on. So the main way that people decide, if a clinician will decide if your brain is working the way it should be, is through your behavior. And I don't mean by you behaving badly or you jumping around and acting crazy. They'll ask you questions. So they'll say to you, for example, what's your name? Who's the president of the United States? They'll ask you questions to see if you can actually pull basic things out of your mind. And then they might ask you a little bit more complex questions. They might say, I'm going to tell you 3 words, and you should read those words back to me in reverse order. So mattress, elephant, and cat. And you would have to say cat, elephant, mattress. Well, maybe 10 minutes later, they might ask you if you remember those words. So again, it's very onerous, and it's not very sensitive to brain changes. You can imagine if you're tired, it might be hard, but you could probably pull yourself together to answer questions like that. And in fact, most people do. Even very sick people can kind of pull it together to answer those simple questions. So what we did is we developed something called the Dana Brain Vital. And this was a recent project that my company did, very different from the projects I showed you before with high-tech virtual reality and robotics. And instead, what we did is we said, let's program on any mobile device. Let's take any smartphone, any tablet, and let's find scientifically validated brain games that would very, very sensitively detect if you have a change in brain function. So games like the one that you see on the screen is called Choice Reaction Time. Very simple. You're going to get the answer right. It's a 2. Now you need to choose the left button, which says 2, 3, or the other one, 4, 5. But you're supposed to do it fast. So guess what? People do make mistakes because they come very quickly. So we can very, very quickly catch you in a mistake, especially if you start getting tired, especially if you didn't have a good night's sleep, especially if you're stressed out, on a new medication, have a head injury, have dementia. We can pick up all those things. Now, we can't diagnose you. That's what a clinician has to do. But we can say, wait a minute, the brain thermometer says there's something wrong. Let's go check that out. So that's the brain thermometer, and it's very sensitive. And why is it sensitive? And how is it sensitive? It's looking at your reaction time. It's like your brain reflex. How quickly can you react to something? And in order for our brains to react properly, we need a bunch of things. And I'm just talking about everyday things. So here's some everyday things that our brain needs in order for it to work just perfectly. Physical activity, that helps get oxygen to the brain. That helps with the healthiness of the brain. Nutrition, same. The brain needs good nutrients in order to function properly. It needs less stress. If you're stressed out all the time, those hormones start making changes in the brain to the neurons in the brain. We don't have time to go into neurons and synapses and neurotransmitters, but all of those things are affected by all of these things on the list. Novelty, what does that mean? Novelty means learning something. Learning is actually keeping your brain healthy. And you may have heard the term lifelong learning. Well, that's not just a buzzword. It's actually really important for keeping your brain healthy. I'll give you an example. During quarantine, I decided to learn how to play the ukulele. And I don't play a musical instrument. I'm not musical. So learning to strum on a ukulele, pluck chords with my left hand, strum with my right, maybe try and sing, it is making my brain hurt. I can feel the neurons connecting because it's making me work in a different way, and I'm learning it. And as I learn it, that's actually keeping my brain healthy. And then, of course, sleep. So sleep is so important for keeping the brain healthy. So where I wanted to end sort of the formal part, and then we can certainly spend as much time as you want answering questions. How can technology help? What I wanted you to do is take a couple minutes, and then we'll talk about it together, and I'll give you some examples. How can technology, and how does technology in our everyday life help us with these things? How does technology help us get physical activity? How does technology help us get better nutrition, less stress, novelty, sleep? All of those things. Think of some good examples in your own life and put them in the chat. How technology is already helping you. Just think about what kind of technology you use in your everyday life. Oh, we have some great examples coming through here. Oh yeah, okay, so listening to music, whether it's whatever you're listening it through, whether you're listening to it online, whether you're listening it through your AirPods. I mean, technology is enabling access to music everywhere, which is phenomenal. Technology, physical activity, tracking the types of exercises we do and the time, so tracking, motivating us to do it. Research, technology is helping us do the research on these things. Oh, it helps us with knowledge. We go outside to find nice things and learn about them. Does anyone do geocaching? I love geocaching because I actually the geocaches are hidden in places that I never would think to go myself. Let's see, what else? Sleep tracking, at-home streaming of workouts, treadmills, like the Peloton, Fitbit, ebooks, distance learning. Oh, this is great. Yeah, lots of great stuff. Step counts, Apple Watch. Okay, so how-to videos. This is great. Wow, great examples. Great examples. Oh, we have another geocacher. Fantastic. Well, great. So most of these examples that I'm going to show you now, most of you have already come up with. Maybe there'll be a few more that we can talk about also think about, as I'm going through some of these examples, think about what future technology could help us do. What's the future? So, for example, sorry, I'm trying to uncover my screen now. An iWatch, Fitbit, wearables, that's one that's a lot of you brought up. How about something simple, like a contact lens? I mean, we don't even think about glasses and contact lens that have been around for so long. We take them for granted, but they're incredible technology. And in fact, I just had not too long ago eye surgery so that I don't wear contacts anymore. What I want to know is, when am I going to be able to get the eye surgery that gives me telescoping vision or night vision, right? Is that in our future, to actually have, night vision. That would make my life better. So think about not only these, the technologies that we have in hand, but where might these technologies be going, and what are the ethics behind it? There's actually no reason why we couldn't have better than 20/20 eyesight, but there's some real ethical considerations around that. Who would have access to that technology? Are there unintended consequences? So those are some things to think about when we're talking about technology. Would it overtax our brain? Our brain was not designed to have telescoping vision. So I think there's a lot of things to think about there. Let's see, what else? Let me get up the next example. So telemedicine, I think a lot of you may have experienced this over the past few months, if not before, where now we're video conferencing with our doctors. Well, that's been around for a long time. We just weren't accustomed to doing it. And what's really cool are some of these sensors. This is an EKG, so it actually will measure your heart rate through your cell phone. And the doctor can diagnose if you have atrial fibrillation, potentially. So cardiovascular disease could be remotely diagnosed. And that is happening now. And think of where that's going to go. The more sensors we have in our homes, the more sensors that our doctors have access to, that's really going to change how medicine is. And in fact, if you think about it, with all of the wearable sensors and digital technology I interact with, I generate more data in a day than my doctor has used to see in a year. So we have a huge amount of data that's going to help with medicine. Robots. Some of you asked about how many robots I built. I built a series of robots. Jesterbot became Cosmobot, and then we had 3 versions of Cosmobot. We never brought it to market. It's actually very hard to bring robots to market. They're expensive, and there's not a big market. Well, this is one robot that actually is on the market now, and it's to help the elderly Maybu, and it's to remind them to take their medicine. It's to remind them to take a walk, to help them learn new things. It is all about brain health. Having a robot friend that encourages you to contact your friends, your family. So we'll see what happens with Maybu. It doesn't move around, but it's very cute. Look for some videos of Maybu. It's very cute. All right, does anyone know what this is? This was really hot a couple years ago, and it got people out the door. Pokemon Go, right? Augmented reality. This is going to be the wave of the future. The idea that your spatial environment is also digitized. So we know when you're FaceTiming with someone, that map of where they are is actually part of what you can interact with. You can reach through their phone and change their stereo for them. So spatial computing is another area that's growing. And then here's kind of a collaborative VR. I think we're finding now in quarantine, even just with all these Zoom calls, our ability to collaborate with each other. And you students know this. You're already digital natives. You're also digital collaborators. You work all the time with your friends via FaceTime and whatever else. But now imagine that you can do that in an immersive environment. You can put on your VR headset and work with other people to design things and make things. So that's super exciting. So I'm going to end there with this slide with just some resources on both biomedical engineering and neuroscience. And there's just some great resources and activities that you can do, particularly for high school, but it goes through all ages. And let's see what kind of questions we have. Oh, what has been I'll start from the bottom up, sorry, and Dawn will look through and I'll go through too. But so the glove used to be for sale. It's not anymore. And I'll tell you why. This is one of the challenges in working with technology. As fun as it is, and I'll get to my favorite project in a moment, technology changes so quickly. So for example, we built that robot 20 years ago. That technology was very expensive back then and very hard to put together. When we did the sensors, when we did the glove, it was the same thing. Sensors were actually very expensive and kind of big. And so within 6 months of putting the glove on the market, there were new sensors because the field advances pretty fast. And so people wanted a custom glove with new sensors. So we ended up making a series of custom gloves for people who wanted them for different applications. So for many years, we really made gloves that were customized for people. So favorite project to work on, my favorite project is always the one that I'm working on because that's the project that I'm excited about. It's the new problem I'm trying to solve. Once I've developed the technology solution, I get a little bored. I want someone else to go sell it or manufacture it, or like those challenges are interesting to other people. I really love the early stage of saying, what is interesting about this and how can I solve that problem? So there's so many projects. And I think, someone came to me the other day and said, this was about a year ago, and said, we want to build something that can stimulate the vagus nerve. I'm like, tell me more. That sounds very interesting. Well, just like an implantable pacemaker, which helps your heart work, there's an implantable device that you can put in your neck that stimulates your vagus nerve. And it's used to cure things like rheumatoid arthritis and Crohn's disease. And so the question was, could we make one that didn't have to be implanted by surgery, one that could be used at the surface of your body? And so if any of you have ever gotten physical therapy and had electrical stimulation of your muscles, we took one of those devices that's called a TENS device, and we actually put it in the ear, which the top part of the ear called the Simba concha. And when you stimulate that with electricity, it goes straight to your vagus nerve. So we invented a device that could stimulate the vagus nerve. So it's really the invention part that I get excited about. And I'm always excited about whatever invention I'm working on now. That's my favorite. Let's see, lots about, COVID-19. Let me talk about that. So originally when COVID struck, it really seemed like it was a disease of the lungs, of the respiratory system, and that was really the main effect. And it still is obviously a very serious effect. But it's clear now that it also affects your central nervous system. One of the symptoms that has becoming more and more common is that the loss of smell and taste, and that's even in mild cases of COVID. So through the olfactory bulb, it's affecting the brain. You're losing the smell and taste. It's also causing strokes and seizures. Now, a lot of that is indirectly because of blood clots. So it's affecting cardiovascular function, which then in turn affects the brain. But we're also seeing direct effects on these reflexes. Remember, I talked about reaction time and how quick are your brain reflexes. We're absolutely seeing effect on those reflexes. And in fact, we have a project with the National Institutes of Health using our Dana thermometer, tracking the elderly for mild cognitive impairment to look at progression to dementia. We're looking at expanding that project right now to work with several of the COVID clinics to track people in a telehealth way, in a virtual way, and track their cognitive function. So it's very interesting that we had a tool that we had already started using with older patients in their home. And it was recognized that that could be a very good solution for doing research in COVID. So we're hoping to start that project in the next few weeks. Fingers crossed, we should hear from NIH. But absolutely, COVID is affecting the brain, and we don't know how serious those long-term effects are going to be. But I'm hoping to help design the solution for that as well. What technology do you predict will become bigger that humans will use daily? So I talked a little bit about, when I was talking about Pokemon Go, I talked a little bit about this idea of spatial computing. And it's something that it's very hard to explain, but it really combines the fact that we have the internet with virtual reality and FaceTime and all of these things. The fact that all of the objects in our world will have knowledge of each other. So now imagine when you come down your your bedroom to breakfast, objects just move out of your way. Your chair moves to get under you when you start to sit. A drawer opens to give you, and you can reach in and get the fork. So objects are going to start having awareness of both their own location in space and your location in space. And this is what I'm talking about, the spatial computing. So I think that's going to be something that we're going to see more and more of. And there's a free app called Vuforia Chalk. I'll type it in I work very closely. I'm actually on the board of a company called PTC. So I'll disclose that. But this is just a free app. But Vuforia Chalk, if you download it and play with your friends, you'll see what I mean. It's different than FaceTime. If you are using, it looks like FaceTime, but then if you start circling objects in your friend's space, those circles will stay there wherever they move around in the space. So let's say you called someone and said, I need help fixing this TV remote. You could FaceTime with them and they could actually point you through all the steps. So it's a little bit hard to explain, but try it out and you'll get a sense of what spatial computing is. Let's see. How many times did you fail in making your glove? That's a great question as well. I've failed a lot, but it's funny because I don't look back and think of it as failing. It's when you're designing something, you try a lot of things. Have you ever heard the phrase, fail often, fail fast? Something like that. There's some, it's like you have to try lots and lots of different ways of doing something to find the best way to do something. Because even if you fail, maybe there was something about that design you can bring to the next design. So it's not, I hate calling it failure because failure, again, has had such a stigma that's part of it. But, I think I question what failure is because a lot of the products that we invented and developed over the years don't exist anymore. So is that a failure? Or did that help, push the technology forward? Sometimes it's very hard to look back at things you do in the past and say, what is the definition of success? So I think that's something that we all struggle with through life. I mean, the question I ask myself for any project is this an important question? Is it an interesting question? Will it help us think about a different way to use technology? And even if this particular project doesn't become a commercial success or even a technological success, the fact that we're really trying to think about things in a new way and other people see that's important. And that inspires other people to think again in a new way and think of new ideas. So yes, failing happens to me all the time. And it's a good thing. Okay, so what is being done to protect personal data of health and exercise apps we use? That's a big question, and I don't know all the answers to that. There's a couple things. Everyone has responsibility there. Certainly, I as a owner of these apps, I have a responsibility to check the settings and make sure I'm comfortable. I mean, I think we've all gotten a little bit, I know I have a little bit lackadaisical in just accepting terms and not looking at settings. And so almost all of these apps now have settings where you can decide what level of data you're willing to share, whether you're even willing to share it at all off of your phone. A lot of this data can be kept private now. So it's really important to check, to sort of be proactive and make sure you're comfortable with what that data, where that data is going. Now, certainly for a medical device, so for the brain thermometer that I'm talking about that we're tracking patients, there's very, very strict controls there. That data has to go to what's called a HIPAA compliant cloud. And you may have heard the term HIPAA because many times when you go to a doctor, you have to sign a HIPAA form, who gets to see your data. So when we share our data from the app to the cloud, it goes to a very, very specific HIPAA compliant cloud that doesn't allow any sharing of that. What do you see as the negative effects of technology on the brain now and in the future? So I'm fundamentally a techno-optimist. And so I definitely live by this idea that if you want to predict the future, create it. That's a quote that I think has been attributed to a lot of people, I think including Abraham Lincoln. So, but if you want to predict the future, you have to create it. And so technology can always be used to solve bad problems as well as good problems. It's just a tool. And so I'm very committed to trying to develop technology for good and so I think it's very hard to predict unintended consequences. But in terms of the brain, I think the data, there's constantly research now on how are digital natives' brains different than, us digital immigrants. There's constantly research being done, and different isn't necessarily bad. I feel certain that maybe their brains will be more resilient because maybe the next generation won't get Alzheimer's because they'll have their brains will be different because of technology. I don't know. I mean, that might be an unintended consequence that we can't even predict. So again, I don't have an answer. I think they're really important questions to continue to ask as we, as an inventor. Every time I work with technology and every project I do, I absolutely am thinking about what are the unintended consequences and how is this technology affecting, the whole person, the whole community, the whole world? Is it accessible? Is it going to be affordable? Are there going to be have and have-nots? Those are really important questions about technology as well.
Are there any everyday ways to check brain health, for example, at the doctor's?
Yeah, that's a great question. Everyday ways to check brain health. There's not an acceptable way to check brain health right now. There are a lot of brain game applications that are just really meant for wellness and fun. But it's interesting to try those because if you try the same game every day, for example, and you notice that some days you're not as good, some days it's harder, some days it's better. Like I play a lot of these brain game apps just because I'm curious. These are not scientifically validated apps, but they're very similar in terms of reaction time. And so if you have a simple app that you like that has a brain game, it's worth playing it, a couple times a week and see how it changes with how much sleep you get, for example. And there are definitely some online things that are consumer facing saying, check your brain health, check your brain score. And I would encourage you to play with them and try them, but I wouldn't take them too seriously because one of the big things they do is they compare you to a database of thousands of people. And really, when you're talking about sensitively looking at changes in brain health, you really have to compare yourself to yourself. You need to see how do you change over time, not how you change compared to everybody else. But there's a lot of stuff online, like know your brain age, know your brain score. Yeah, play with them. None of them are scientifically validated, but they're all fun and they're all will give you a sense of is something harder or easier if I had sleep or if I didn't. That's a simple test right there.
All right, and last question is, why do people have brain damage?
So there's a lot of ways you can damage your brain. You can damage it physically. You can actually have physical damage where tissue is damaged, bone, your skull is damaged. You can also have damage at the neuron level, at the activity level. The neurons might not fire the same way because the neurotransmitters and the chemistry. So there's so many ways to develop brain damage. Your neurons work very well because they're covered with what are called myelin sheaths. That enables the neurons to fire fast. There's lots of things that can break down the myelin sheaths and can result in diseases like Parkinson's, multiple sclerosis. And, so damage is a tough word because it really means, what do you mean by damage? Like, would you consider dementia damage, even if we can't really necessarily detect any work, sometimes you just can't detect the damage. So there's so many reasons. And in fact, most chronic diseases cause some form of brain damage. Cardiovascular disease, if you have high blood pressure for a long time, if you have sleep apnea and don't use your CPAP machine and don't get oxygen to your brain, if you're overweight and have diabetes and high blood sugar, all of those things eventually are going to cause long-term brain dysfunction or damage.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Lathan. Great questions came through for you today. Excellent. Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody, for joining. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.